James Cooper was 19 years old when he realized he had exactly enough lumber for a cabin 8 feet by 10 feet. Not 8 by 12, not 10 by 12, 8 by 10, 80 square feet of living space. He sat on the ground outside Laramie, Wyoming Territory in September 1868, looking at the stack of boards he'd bought with money from 6 months working at the railroad. Counted them again, did the math again, hoped somehow the numbers would change. They didn't. He had enough lumber for walls that would create a space 8 feet by 10 feet, barely larger than a horse stall, smaller than most people's bedrooms, smaller than the orphanage dormitory he'd left 3 years ago. James had been orphaned at 12 years old in the summer of 1861 when cholera swept through their settlement outside Omaha. His father, Samuel Cooper, died first. Took sick on a Tuesday morning, dead by Thursday evening. His mother, Margaret, lasted 3 more days, holding on long enough to tell James she loved him, that he was strong enough to survive anything, that he should remember them but not let grief paralyze him. He'd watched both parents die in the same bed, helpless to do anything except bring water and hold hands and witness the brutal efficiency of disease that didn't care about love or family or the plans people made for futures that would never arrive. The neighbors had been kind but practical. Nobody could take in another mouth to feed. James had one surviving aunt in Boston who'd never met him and wrote back saying her circumstances didn't permit housing an orphan nephew. So James went to the Omaha Orphan Asylum with the clothes he wore and $2 a neighbor pressed into his hand. The asylum wasn't cruel exactly, just institutional. 40 boys in one dormitory, wooden bunks stacked 3 high, 6 feet of personal space per child. Meals served in shifts because the dining hall couldn't hold everyone. Work duties every day, cleaning, laundry, yard work, whatever the superintendent assigned. James learned to make himself small, to need little space, to survive in crowding that would have driven him mad before his parents died. Learned that privacy was memory, not reality. That home was whatever space you currently occupied, not the house full of memories you'd lost. He'd stayed until 16, working the asylum's farm, learning carpentry from Mr. Henderson, who supervised maintenance, saving every penny from small jobs neighbors hired orphans for. On his 16th birthday in 1865, the superintendent called him in for the standard conversation. "You're old enough to make your own way now. We need the bed for younger children. Here's $2. Good luck." Just like that, childhood was officially over. Had really ended at 12 when his parents died. But now it was administratively complete. He'd worked farms, worked freight yards, worked railroad construction, saved every penny he could, came to Wyoming Territory because land was cheap and he wanted something permanent, something his, something that couldn't be taken away the way family had been taken, the way childhood had been stolen. He'd filed a homestead claim, 160 acres under the Homestead Act of 1862. Free land if he could prove up, build a dwelling, cultivate the land, live there 5 years. After 5 years, the land would be his, legal title, property, permanence. But building a dwelling required materials, materials required money. And James had $32 total after buying his lumber, not enough for a cabin of normal size, only enough for something tiny, something everyone would mock. He could wait. Save more money, buy more lumber. Build a proper 12 by 16 cabin like sensible homesteaders built. But waiting meant another winter living in a tent, another winter working railroad jobs instead of improving his claim, another winter of temporary existence when what he craved was permanent. He made a decision. He'd build the 8 by 10 cabin, but he'd build it right, build it so well that size wouldn't matter. Build it to prove that small could be better than large if engineered correctly. He started by digging a foundation below frost line, beginning work the morning after finalizing his cabin plans. 4 feet down into Wyoming soil that was part clay, part rock. Difficult digging that made his hands blister within an hour. But foundation mattered. Mr. Henderson at the orphanage had taught him A building is only as good as what holds it up. Foundation fails, everything fails. So James dug, 4 feet deep around an 8 by 10 perimeter, carried bucket after bucket of soil out of the hole. His back ached, his hands bled through the cloth he'd wrapped them in, but he kept digging until he had a trench the proper depth. Then he gathered river rocks for 3 weeks, walking the creek half a mile away, selecting stones that would stack well, carrying them back in a canvas sack that weighed 40 pounds when full, made 30 trips, maybe 40, carried over a ton of stone by hand. He built the stone foundation carefully, starting below grade, stacking rocks with mud mortar he mixed himself, creating walls that would support his cabin for decades if done correctly. Each stone tested for stability, each course leveled before starting the next. The work was slow, methodical, precise. By early October he had his foundation complete, raised 18 inches above grade to protect wood from ground moisture, level, solid, ready for framing. Then he built walls, using every board he owned, but not normal walls, double walls with space between. He framed the exterior wall first, using his limited dimensional lumber to create studs every 16 inches, nailed sheathing boards horizontally to create the outer skin. This gave him an 8 by 10 exterior footprint. Then, 12 inches inward from that exterior wall, he framed an inner wall. Same technique, studs every 16 inches, sheathing nailed horizontally. The space between the two walls, that crucial 12-inch cavity, would be his insulation. But he didn't have expensive wool batting or manufactured insulation. He had prairie grass and creek clay. He gathered grass for 2 weeks, cut it with a borrowed scythe, dried it in the autumn sun, bundled it tight, needed hundreds of pounds. Each armload carried back to his building site, each bundle stored carefully to stay dry. He dug clay from the creek bank, good sticky clay that would bind the grass and create an airtight barrier, mixed it with water to the right consistency, thick enough to hold, wet enough to work with his hands. Then he packed the walls, grass laid horizontally, clay smeared between layers, pressed down tight to eliminate air pockets, layer after layer, bottom to top, working from inside the cavity using a stick to compress everything as tightly as possible. The mixture dried hard, creating a solid insulation mass 12 inches thick. His hands were constantly raw from the work. Clay dried his skin until it cracked. Grass cuts covered his forearms. But the walls took shape. 18 inches thick total. 6 inches of exterior wall, 12 inches of grass-clay insulation, 6 inches of interior wall. When finished, those walls would be thermal fortresses, nothing getting through them. For the roof, he used the same principle, double layer of boards with packed grass-clay insulation between. Built the roof on the ground first, creating sections he could lift into place. Each section weighed over 200 pounds. Lifting them alone onto the walls required leverage, a tripod made from lodgepole pines, ropes, and determination that nearly killed him twice when ropes slipped and sections came crashing down. But he got it done. The roof went up, heavy and insulated and engineered, to hold heat the way normal roofs never could. The cabin design was unusual, 8 by 10 feet exterior, but with 18-inch walls on all sides, the interior was only 5 feet by 7 feet. 35 square feet of living space, smaller than a prison cell, but those walls would hold heat like a thermos. And in Wyoming winter, heat retention mattered more than space. For the roof, he created the same thick design. Double layer of boards with packed grass-clay insulation between, 18 inches thick, heavy, but thermally efficient. Windows were a single small opening, 1 foot square on the south wall, just enough for light, covered with oiled paper, minimal heat loss. The door was thick too, built from double boards with insulation between, heavy, tight-fitting. When closed, almost no air exchange. The first person to see the construction was Robert Mitchell, whose homestead bordered James's claim. Robert rode over to welcome the new neighbor and stopped his horse to stare at what James was building. "Son, What in hell is that? James was packing grass clay mixture into the wall cavity. Cabin, sir. That's not a cabin. That's a box. How big is that thing? 6 feet. 8 by 10 exterior, 5 by 7 interior once walls are finished. Robert dismounted, walked around the tiny structure. 5 by 7? You can't live in 5 by 7 feet. That's a closet. That's smaller than my chicken coop. It's what I can afford to build. I have limited lumber. Then buy more lumber, or build it bigger with thinner walls. This is ridiculous. You're building prison cell. I'm building efficient shelter. Small space heats faster, maintains temperature better. These 18-inch walls will hold heat that normal cabins leak. Robert shook his head. Son, I don't know what fool idea got in your head, but this won't work. You can't live in a box this small. You'll go mad within a week, trust me. Build something normal-sized, even if the walls are thinner. I can't afford normal-sized. This is what my money buys, so I'm building it to work. Robert left looking troubled, and by evening the story was spreading through the Laramie homesteader community. The kid, barely 19, was building a cabin the size of an outhouse. With walls so thick he'd have no room to turn around inside. Clearly didn't know what he was doing. Orphan boy trying to homestead without any sense. More people came to look. Some offered advice. Others just laughed. "You building a doghouse?" one man called out, riding past with friends. "Seen bigger coffins?" another joked. Sarah Preston, whose family had an established ranch nearby, stopped with genuine concern. "Young man, I understand money is tight, but you can't live in that. It's not humane. Perhaps you should reconsider homesteading until you have more resources." "Mom, I appreciate the concern, but I've slept in smaller spaces. Orphanage dormitory was crowded. Railroad bunkhouses were cramped. This will be mine. That's what matters." "But it's so small. How will you even fit a bed and stove?" "Bed along one wall, stove in corner, table folds down from opposite wall. I've measured everything. It fits." "You'll suffocate. No air circulation in a space that small with those thick walls." "There's ventilation. Chimney provides draft. Small window. I've designed it carefully." Sarah left, shaking her head, convinced the boy would die of his own stubbornness before Christmas. The mockery intensified as James completed the cabin. By late October, it stood finished. 8 feet by 10 feet of thick-walled structure that looked more like a miniature fortress than a home. The walls were so thick the tiny cabin appeared squat, compressed, almost comical. Inside was exactly as cramped as everyone predicted, 5 feet by 7 feet. James could touch all 4 walls standing in center, could walk 4 steps in one direction, 3 in the other. The bed took up one entire wall. The small stove occupied a corner, a fold-down table attached to the opposite wall. Shelves built into the thick walls for storage. It was tight, incredibly tight. But James had lived in orphanage dormitories with 40 boys in a room, had shared railroad bunkhouses with 20 men. Privacy and 35 square feet felt luxurious compared to that. More importantly, it was his walls, his roof, his door, first thing he'd ever owned, first permanent place he'd ever had. The size didn't diminish that. If anything, the smallness made it more his. Every inch was his doing, his effort, his achievement. He moved in on November 1st. The cabin immediately became the settlement's favorite joke. "Seen Cooper's cabin? Need to back out to turn around. Boy's living in a box, actual box. Give him a month. He'll go crazy from cabin fever. Can't stay sane in a space that small." The Laramie newspaper ran a humorous piece. Local youth builds smallest dwelling in territory. Entire cabin smaller than average bedroom. James heard the mockery, ignored it. He was warm. The thick walls and small space meant his tiny stove heated the interior to 70 degrees with minimal wood. Heat had nowhere to go, no large space to dissipate into. The insulation prevented loss through walls. He used maybe 1/10 the firewood his neighbors burned. While they were chopping cords of wood, he was comfortable with a small pile. The efficiency was remarkable. November brought cold weather. Temperature dropped to 10 degrees. 20 degrees inside normal cabins, despite fires burning constantly. James's cabin, 68 degrees, with a fire the size of a man's hand. The thermal mass of those thick walls absorbed heat during the day, radiated it back at night. But the mockery continued. People were convinced he'd suffer. That small was wrong regardless of how well it worked. December brought the test that would prove everything. The storm that Wyoming historical records would later call the Great Freeze of 1868. Though people living through it called it simply the storm that killed everything, the storm that proved which building methods were survival and which were suicide. It started on December 7th with subtle warnings most people missed or ignored. The air pressure dropped noticeably. Barometers fell rapidly, creating that particular headache pressure sensitive people felt. Animals went silent. Birds disappeared. The quality of morning light was wrong, grey in a way that warned of serious weather approaching. Temperature at dawn, 20 degrees, cold but manageable. Normal for Wyoming December, by 9 a.m., 15 degrees. Dropping faster than normal, by 11, 10 degrees. People started noticing, started checking wood supplies, started wondering if this would be bad. By noon, 0 degrees, 4 hours from 20 to 0. That was fast, too fast. The kind of rapid drop that meant Arctic air pushing south with nothing to slow it. By 2 p.m., minus 10 degrees, wind building from the northwest. That particular wind direction that meant sustained cold, not just a passing front. Wind speed at 25 miles per hour and increasing. By evening 6 p.m., minus 25 degrees with wind at 50 miles per hour. The storm had arrived with full force. Snow started falling around 3 p.m., not gentle flakes. Dense, heavy snow driven horizontal by increasing wind. Visibility dropped to 50 feet, then 20, then 5. By dark, you couldn't see your hand at arm's length. The world was white chaos and howling wind and cold that cut through normal clothing like it wasn't there. Temperature kept dropping through the night, minus 30 by midnight, minus 35 by 2 a.m., minus 40 by 4 a.m. Wind sustained at 65 miles per hour with gusts reaching 80. The sound was continuous thunder, continuous roar, like standing beside a waterfall made of ice and fury. Snow accumulated at terrifying speed. 3 feet by midnight of the first day, 5 feet by dawn of day 2, 8 feet by evening of day 2, drifts reaching 12 feet, 15 feet against north-facing walls where wind drove snow into massive accumulations. Large cabins with normal construction struggled immediately on day 1. Robert Mitchell's 12 by 16 cabin with standard 8-inch walls had an interior volume of nearly 200 cubic feet. Heating that volume required his large cast-iron stove burning at maximum capacity, but the cold found every microscopic gap in his walls, every place where boards met imperfectly, every crack around the doorframe. He burned wood faster than he'd thought possible. A normal day's supply disappeared in 6 hours. He started rationing, trying to make wood last, letting temperature drop to conserve fuel. By evening of day 2, his cabin was 30 degrees inside despite fire burning. By day 3, 20 degrees. His hands were numb. His feet had no feeling. He recognized hypothermia setting in but had no solution. Burning more wood just meant running out sooner. The Preston family ranch house had even worse problems. 2 stories, 6 rooms, over 800 cubic feet of space to heat. They sealed off 5 rooms on day 1, crowding the entire family, 8 people, into the kitchen where the large cook stove burned continuously. But that stove consumed wood at a devastating rate. Half a cord per day just to maintain 40 degrees in 1 room. They burned furniture on day 3 when the woodpile ran low. Chairs, table, bed frames, anything wooden went into the fire. By day 4, They were burning floorboards from the sealed-off rooms, pulling up planks and feeding them into the flames. The children cried from cold. The adults tried not to show their fear, but everyone understood. If the storm lasted 2 more days, they'd run out of combustible material. Then they'd freeze. James's tiny cabin was 72 degrees inside. He burned 3 small pieces of wood per day. That was all. 3 pieces in his tiny stove. The heat had nowhere to go in 35 square feet. The 18-inch insulated walls prevented any loss. The thick insulated roof stopped heat from rising out. The small space actually worked in his favor. Body heat from one person was significant in 35 square feet. Combined with minimal fire, it was enough, more than enough. He was comfortable in his tiny box while people in large proper cabins were freezing. On the 4th day at around 3 p.m., James heard desperate pounding on his thick insulated door. The sound was barely audible over the wind roar, but James heard it. Someone was out there. Someone was dying. He opened the door, had to lean his full weight against it to overcome wind pressure, and Robert Mitchell literally fell inside, collapsing onto the small floor space. The man's face was blue-gray, lips cracked and bleeding, eyes unfocused. His clothing was covered in frost from his own breath, freezing instantly in -40 air. "Cooper!" Robert gasped through chattering teeth. "Please! Out of wood. Cabin's 15 degrees, maybe less. Can't feel my hands. Can't... Please!" James pulled him fully inside, shut the door against wind that fought to keep it open. The transition was shocking. -40 outside, 72 inside. Robert's body couldn't process the difference. He started shaking violently as blood flow resumed to cold, constricted vessels as his core temperature tried to rise too fast. "Don't move," James said. "Stay still. Let your body adjust gradually." He wrapped Robert in his spare blanket, gave him water in tiny sips, kept him away from the small stove where rapid warming could cause shock, watched him carefully for signs of frostbite or hypothermia complications. Robert just stared around the impossibly tiny space, unable to comprehend what he was experiencing. "How?" he finally said, voice still trembling. "How is it this warm? Your chimney's barely smoking. You're burning nothing. My cabin has a fire 3 times this size, and it's barely above freezing." "Volume," James said simply. "Your cabin's 200 cubic feet. Mine's 35. You're trying to heat 6 times the space I am. Plus, my walls are 18 inches thick with insulation. Yours are 8 inches without. I hold heat, you leak it." "I mocked you," Robert said quietly. "Called this a box. Called you foolish. Said nobody could live in a space this small. And now it's the only reason I'm alive. You weren't wrong about the size. It is small, but small can be strength if you're trying to survive winter with limited resources." They sat in silence for a while, listening to wind howl outside, feeling warmth that normal cabins couldn't achieve. Robert kept checking the thermometer James had mounted on the wall, unable to believe it consistently read 72 degrees. 2 hours later, more pounding. Weaker this time. James opened the door to find Thomas Preston supporting his wife, who was barely conscious. Behind them, 3 children, the youngest being carried by the oldest. "Cooper," Thomas gasped. "Ranch house. Ran out of fuel. Been burning floorboards. Down to 20 degrees inside. Wife collapsed. Children showing hypothermia. Please, I know we mocked you. I know we said your cabin was ridiculous, but please, the children." James pulled them inside. 7 people now in 35 square feet. They couldn't all sit, could barely all fit, bodies pressed together standing, no room to move, no space to turn around. But they were warm. The body heat of 7 people in that tiny space raised the temperature to 78 degrees without James adding any wood to his small fire. 7 human furnaces in a perfectly insulated box. Mrs. Preston regained consciousness within 15 minutes. The children stopped their blue-lipped shaking within 20. Color returned to faces. Fingers and toes began hurting. "Painful but good," meant tissue was alive and warming. "This is impossible," Thomas said, unable to process what physics was demonstrating. "This tiny cabin, this box we call too small to live in, is warmer than my entire 6-room house. Warmer with 7 people than my house with 8. How is this real?" "It's real because size isn't the metric for winter survival," James said. "Thermal efficiency is. You built large because large seems proper. I built small because small was all I could afford. Turned out poverty forced me into the better design." "We called you foolish," Mrs. Preston said quietly, tears in her eyes. "Said you didn't know what you were doing, said an orphan boy had no business homesteading, and you saved our children's lives with the home we mocked. You weren't the only ones who mocked it, Mom. Pretty much everyone did. But mockery doesn't change physics. Small, insulated space will always heat more efficiently than large, uninsulated space. That's just math." By evening of day 5, 11 people were crammed into James's 35 square feet. Standing room only. Bodies pressed together. 0 privacy. 0 comfort in terms of space. But alive. Warm. Protected from a storm that would have killed them in their own homes. The tiny cabin that everyone had called inadequate, that people had literally laughed at, was functioning as a survival shelter while proper-sized cabins with normal construction failed their occupants. The mockery had been proved spectacularly, dangerously wrong. James's tiny cabin that everyone had mocked was saving lives while proper-sized cabins failed their occupants. The storm broke on December 13th. 6 days of sustained cold and snow. They emerged to find the landscape transformed. Every large cabin showed damage or depletion. The Mitchell cabin had burned all its furniture and half its floorboards. The Preston ranch house was intact but depleted of fuel and supplies. James's cabin was unchanged, still had most of his small woodpile, still warm, still functional. Robert Mitchell stood in the snow, looking at the tiny structure that had saved his life. "I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe you my life. You don't owe me anything, sir. I called you foolish, mocked your cabin, told everyone you didn't know what you were doing. I didn't really. I just did what I could afford and tried to make it work. Turned out small and efficient beat large and wasteful." The community saw James differently after the storm, not as a foolish orphan boy, as an innovative builder who'd solved a problem everyone else missed. Men started asking how he'd built the thick walls, how he'd calculated the insulation, whether the design could be scaled up slightly, maybe 10 by 12 with the same thick walls. James helped them, showed his techniques. The grass-clay insulation mixture, the double wall construction, the thermal efficiency calculations he'd done instinctively. By spring of 1869, 7 homesteaders had built small, heavily insulated cabins using James's principles, not as tiny as his. Most were 10 by 12 or 12 by 14, but all had thick insulated walls. All prioritized thermal efficiency over size. All survived the next winter better than conventional cabins. James stayed in his tiny cabin for 5 years as required, proved up his claim in 1873, received legal title to his 160 acres. First thing he'd ever owned outright. He built a larger cabin in 1874, 10 by 14 feet interior, using his saved money. Still smaller than normal, still heavily insulated, but less cramped than the original. He kept the original 8 by 10 cabin, though, used it as storage, and as a reminder that necessity breeds innovation, that limitations force efficiency, that sometimes the solutions everyone mocks are the only ones that work. James Cooper married in 1876, had 4 children, built a successful ranch on his homestead, never became wealthy, but never faced poverty again. He died in 1923 at age 74. His obituary mentioned his ranch, his family, his community contributions. It didn't mention the tiny cabin that saved 11 lives during the Great Freeze of 1868. But in Wyoming Territory, among people who remembered or whose grandparents remembered, they told a different story, about the 19-year-old orphan who built a cabin everyone called too small, about how he survived on efficiency when others relied on size, about how his tiny box saved lives while proper cabins failed, about how James Cooper took poverty and limitation and turned them into innovation that mattered more than resources or conventional wisdom ever could. The original tiny cabin stood until 1941, when it finally collapsed from age. By then, it had lasted 73 years, longer than most normal-sized cabins built the same year, because sometimes small and well-built outlasts large and conventional. Sometimes the thing everyone mocks is the only thing that works when nothing else does. Sometimes poverty forces efficiency that wealth never discovers. And sometimes a boy with nothing builds something that matters more than all the proper houses in the territory combined.